The decision to assign Canada the lead nation responsibility for NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia was not made casually or without deliberate calculation about which alliance member possessed the specific combination of qualities that the mission required. Latvia sits at one of NATO's most strategically exposed positions, a Baltic state sharing a border with Russia and Belarus, with a Russian-speaking minority population whose loyalties have been subject to political manipulation, with geographic vulnerabilities that make conventional defense challenging, and with historical memories of Soviet occupation that shape how its population and government understand the current security environment. The battle group stationed there isn't simply a tripwire force designed to demonstrate alliance commitment. It represents NATO's judgment about which country's military, political, and diplomatic capabilities are best suited to managing a deterrence mission that operates simultaneously on military, political, and informational levels in one of the alliance's most contested spaces. Canada's selection as framework nation for the Latvia battle group reflected several converging considerations that NATO planners and member governments weighed when establishing the Enhanced Forward Presence in 2017. The political calculus began with recognition that Canada possessed credibility as a serious military contributor that smaller or less capable nations couldn't match, but that Canada also lacked the complex bilateral political baggage that larger powers like the United States, Germany, or France carried in their relationships with Russia. American-led battle groups would be interpreted by Moscow as direct escalation. German leadership carried historical weight that complicated Russian information operations but also created domestic political sensitivities within Germany about confrontational postures. And French leadership would introduce Macron-era complexities about European strategic autonomy that might undermine alliance unity. Canada occupied a position where it was militarily credible, politically clear in its alliance commitments, and diplomatically positioned in ways that made it a less target-rich symbol for Russian propaganda than American leadership would have provided. The military dimension of Canada's Latvia assignment required capabilities that went substantially beyond simply contributing soldiers to a multinational formation. As framework nation, Canada was responsible for commanding the battle group, for coordinating contributions from allied nations including Albania, Czech Republic, Iceland, Italy, Montenegro, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Spain, for managing logistics and sustainment for the entire formation, and for integrating the battle group's operations with Latvian National Defense Forces and with broader NATO corps and theater-level command structures. This required not just tactical military competence but sophisticated staff capabilities, interoperability with diverse allied systems and procedures, and command experience in multinational environments that not every NATO member possessed. Canada's decades of experience in multinational operations, from Korea through UN missions to Afghanistan and various NATO deployments, had built exactly this kind of operational interoperability that Framework Nation Command demanded. The specific geography of Latvia created tactical challenges that shaped how Canada had to configure and employ its battle group. Latvia is a relatively small country with flat terrain in much of its territory, a Baltic coastline that creates maritime flank vulnerabilities, forests and wetlands that complicate mechanized operations, and transportation infrastructure oriented in patterns reflecting Soviet-era planning rather than NATO defensive requirements. The Suwalki Gap, the narrow land corridor between Poland and Lithuania that connects the Baltic states to the rest of NATO territory, creates an operational vulnerability that Russian planning has reportedly prioritized. If Russian and Belarusian forces could close the Suwalki Gap, the Baltic states would be isolated from NATO reinforcement by land, placing enormous pressure on air and sea lines of communication. Canada's battle group in Latvia had to be positioned and configured not just to defend Latvian territory, but to contribute to the broader Baltic defense architecture that addressed this vulnerability. The Russian military's demonstrated capabilities and doctrine created specific challenges for Canadian commanders that affected how the battle group had to be structured and how it had to operate. Russian combined arms tactics, as demonstrated in Ukraine, involved sophisticated integration of electronic warfare, precision fires, drone reconnaissance and attack, armored maneuver, and artillery that created tactical environments significantly different from the counterinsurgency operations that had dominated Western military experience during the post-9/11 era. Canadian forces in Latvia had to relearn and practice high-intensity conventional warfare skills that had atrophied during 2 decades of Afghan operations, had to develop tactics for operating in electromagnetically contested environments where communications could be disrupted and positioning systems degraded, and had to understand Russian operational patterns well enough to anticipate and counter moves that Russian forces might make in a crisis or conflict scenario. The information environment in Latvia created additional complexity for Canada's mission that went beyond conventional military responsibilities. Latvia has a significant Russian-speaking minority, concentrated particularly in the eastern Latgale region near the Russian border, a population that has been subject to sustained Russian information operations designed to undermine their identification with the Latvian state, to create narratives about discrimination and mistreatment that could justify Russian intervention, and to cultivate political divisions that might complicate Latvian national defense in a crisis. Canada's battle group existed not just as a military force, but as a visible symbol of alliance commitment that was itself an element of the information environment. Its presence demonstrated that NATO nations were genuinely committed to Latvian defense, that Russian narratives about Western abandonment of Baltic allies were false, and that military intervention would carry costs that Russian calculation would need to incorporate. The specific incident that demonstrated why NATO had given Canada this responsibility, and that attracted international attention to what had been a relatively quiet presence mission, occurred during Russian military exercises near Latvia's border that created genuine uncertainty about whether they represented preparation for actual operations or simply another episode in the pattern of intimidating demonstrations that Russia had used throughout the post-2014 period. Canadian intelligence analysis of Russian force movements, combined with information from Latvian intelligence services and from allied sources, suggested that some elements of the exercises were structured in ways inconsistent with purely demonstrative purposes. Force concentrations, logistics prepositioning, and command and control patterns that departed from previous exercise templates, and that raised questions about whether escalation thresholds were being probed. Canada's response to this situation illustrated the kind of judgment and capability that framework nation responsibility required. The battle group was repositioned to positions that improved defensive utility without creating provocative forward deployments that might accelerate whatever escalation Russian forces might be testing. Communications with allied nations contributing to the battle group were managed in ways that maintained unity of approach and prevented individual nation political pressures from creating gaps in NATO's response. Coordination with Latvian forces ensured that national defense planning was integrated with battle group dispositions. Communication through NATO channels to alliance political leadership provided assessments that supported informed decision-making without creating panic or demanding immediate political responses that might have constrained options. The Russian exercises concluded without incident, but the episode demonstrated that Canada's management of the situation had required exactly the combination of military judgment, diplomatic sensitivity, and multinational coordination that framework nation responsibility demanded. The domestic Canadian political dimension of the Latvia mission reflected broader questions about Canada's role in NATO and about how Canada balanced its defense commitments against competing domestic priorities. The Latvia deployment had initially been controversial in Canada, with critics arguing that stationing forces in a potential confrontation with Russia created risks disproportionate to Canadian interests, that the resources devoted to Latvia could be used for more pressing security needs closer to home, and that Canada was being assigned responsibilities that larger NATO members should bear. Defenders of the commitment argued that Canada's credibility as an alliance member required contributing meaningfully to collective defense, that abandoning the Baltic states would undermine deterrence and ultimately increase the risk of conflict, and that Canada's framework nation role provided influence over alliance decisions and demonstrated capabilities that served Canadian interests beyond the immediate Latvia context. The evolution of the Latvia mission following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 transformed what had been a steady-state deterrence deployment into something more urgent and more complex. The invasion demonstrated that Russian military aggression against sovereign European states was a genuine possibility rather than merely a theoretical risk, that NATO deterrence had failed to prevent Russian action against Ukraine, and that Baltic states faced threats that had moved from the realm of contingency planning to operational urgency. Canada responded by announcing plans to expand the Latvia battle group from its original approximately 500-soldier configuration to a full brigade-sized force of several thousand soldiers, a transformation that would make the Canada-led formation substantially more capable of conducting the kind of defensive operations that the updated threat assessment required. The brigade expansion created new challenges that tested Canada's ability to execute the responsibilities NATO had assigned. Building a brigade requires not just more soldiers but different organizational structures, additional equipment including heavier armor and more sophisticated fire support, expanded logistics and maintenance capabilities, and command and control infrastructure capable of managing a substantially larger formation in complex defensive operations. Canada had to identify and commit units that could deploy without degrading essential domestic capabilities, had to negotiate with allies about what additional contributions they could make to the expanded formation, had to work with Latvia on infrastructure improvements needed to support a larger force, and had to update operational plans to reflect the brigade's expanded capabilities and missions. The question of why NATO gave Canada its most dangerous job in Latvia reflected the alliance's judgment that Canada possessed a unique combination of military capability, political credibility, diplomatic skill, and operational experience that the mission required. The job was dangerous not simply because Latvia borders countries that have demonstrated willingness to use military force against neighbors, but because framework nation responsibility in that environment required managing multiple simultaneous challenges: conventional military deterrence, information environment competition, multinational alliance coordination, host nation relationship management, and domestic political sustainability, in ways that demanded capabilities beyond what purely military considerations would suggest. Canada's track record in multinational operations, its political positioning within the alliance, its military professionalism, and its demonstrated ability to sustain complex overseas commitments over long periods had convinced NATO planners and member governments that Canada could manage these challenges in ways that other potential framework nations could not. The Latvia mission thus represented both an assignment and a recognition: NATO's acknowledgement that Canada had developed capabilities and credibility that made it valuable in demanding roles, and Canada's acceptance of responsibilities that carried genuine risk, but that also provided influence over alliance decisions, and demonstrated a seriousness of purpose that shaped how Canada was perceived and treated within the alliance. Whether Canada would successfully execute this responsibility over the long term depended on sustaining political will, military investment, and diplomatic engagement that framework nation leadership required. A sustained commitment that was more demanding than simply contributing forces to someone else's battle group, but that provided Canada with an alliance role commensurate with its values and its interests in European security.